So what I'd like to do now is just sort of quickly introduce myself, Greg Bondar, National Webinar Host and your New South Wales ACT Director. And of course, my good friend David DeLima, who's the South Australian and Northern Territory State Director. And David and I will be hosting tonight, but in particular, David will be monitoring the questions as you lodge them. And please make sure that, try and keep them short if you can, so that we can get a lot of questions in. Now, what I'd like to mention is, now this is an interesting story because cancelled and persecuted as a Christian has a lot going for it in terms of what we as Christians ought to be doing. And I'm just, while I've got the opportunity, I'd like to mention something like a free publicity, of course, but I'd like to mention my new book that's just come out, Silencing of the Lambs, which talks about the cancel culture, the attack on Christianity in Australia. If anybody's interested, it is available from Concord Publishing. We've got some wonderful contributions from Bill Muhlenberg, Reverend Peter Barnes, and we've got Bernard Gaynor, and also, of course, Mark Latham and Lyle Shelton. So it's a very good collection of readings on why we as Christians ought to be aware of how cancel culture is affecting us in our day-to-day lives. Okay. Our guest speakers tonight, of course, are Jereth Kok. Now, I'll let you introduce yourself, Jereth, but basically Jereth is was or is a GP, a general practitioner, but unfortunately, and I'll let him mention it, he was cancelled for certain tweets and postings he made on social media. John Steenhof, of course, is a well-known, recognised lawyer, and the Australian Law Alliance, of course, is something that John's very much involved with, and John is in fact representing Jereth in legal proceedings, but I'll let John talk about that later. But we are so fortunate to have both of these gentlemen with us tonight because the topic of Christianity, cancel culture, is right at the tip of our tongue. So I look forward to both of them speaking. I'm going to now hand over to Jereth, and please, Jereth, what I'd like you to do is 5 to 7 to 10 minutes, have a chat as to where you are, how you got here. And I can just mention it to everybody that Jereth is getting over COVID at the moment, so he's going to be a little bit coughing and also, I must say, maybe a little bit sort of weak. But Jereth, over to you, and welcome to this webinar. Thank you.
Thanks, Greg. Yeah, I am a little bit weak, and I apologise for the coughing. I'm about day 9 or 10 of it, or something like that now. So it's I'm on the mend, but I will no doubt cough through this. Okay, well, I'll tell you the story. Once upon a time, in a galaxy far, far away, I was a GP working in a clinic in the suburbs of Melbourne, doing what GPs usually do. So washing out earwax, cutting out ingrown toenails, stitching up cuts, putting plasters on broken arms, sticking sharp things inside people, gluing up kids' heads after they've split them open, telling people to say, while I shone a light down their throat and looked at how big their tonsils were. So all of that kind of stuff, writing medical certificates for people's sickies and doing checkups. Every doctor will tell you, you can hear me okay, everyone? Is my volume, Greg? Hello?
Yes, Jereth. Yes, you're good,
okay.
Jereth. You're good to go.
So yeah, look, if you ask many doctors, what is the most satisfying thing that you can ever do as a doctor? Many of them will tell you that the most satisfying thing you can ever do is squeeze a whole lot of pus out of a huge boil. It's something that really, really makes your day. Another thing that is a lot like that is washing out earwax. When you wash out earwax, you really perform a miracle. It's a bit like you're Jesus, or maybe, if not Jesus, Benny Hinn. So someone comes to you, they're completely deaf. You wash out the earwax, all that disgusting stuff comes out, and they can hear again. So it really is like performing a miracle. Very, very satisfying. So anyway, I was there being a GP. It was something that I'd done for about 10 years. Now, one day, about the end of 2017, completely unknown to me, a mysterious person who I've never met, and I don't know who they are, they made a complaint to APRA. This person had been on my personal Facebook page somehow, and they decided that I was saying a few problematic and politically incorrect things. So APRA received this complaint on their desk. It was the first of 2 complaints, both of them from complete strangers. Neither of them were my patients. And so what do? They start a secret investigation. And it really was secret because I only found out about it a year later when they finally told me about it. Why did they start investigating me? Well, that's a good question. I hadn't done anything wrong to any of my patients. None of my patients had ever complained about me, including my gay and lesbian patients. You know, there's a secret investigation. It goes on for about a year. They search my personal Facebook account and they find a whole bunch of posts from 2017, which was the year of the marriage plebiscite. They discover that I advocated for a no vote. APRA also comes across an article that I wrote for Eternity News. In this article, I wrote that sex can't be changed. A man will always be a man, no matter how many visits he makes to a surgeon. Chromosomes are hardwired into our cells, and that kind of thing. Fairly uncontroversial, I would have thought. This article for Eternity gets added to a growing dossier of crimes. The next move is to hire some private investigators to do a big data trawl of the web. Then the investigators dig up more than 2,000 pages of stuff, some of it dating back 10 years. Heaps of juicy stuff there from Bill Muehlenberg's blog, Bill Muehlenberg, who just got a mention by Greg before. It's now August 2019. I've been under investigation at this point for about a year and a half, and APRA proceeds to suspend my ability to practice using emergency powers, which are designed to stop incompetent and negligent doctors who are dangerous to their patients. One Friday afternoon, I'm interrupted while consulting with my patients, and I'm told that within 1 week I will be suspended. Those patients that I see on that Friday afternoon are the last patients that I ever treat. Bang, my means of making a living and providing for my family are cut off indefinitely. But perhaps more upsettingly, my hundreds of patients suddenly have their doctor taken away. Many of these patients are old, frail, medically complicated. They've got chronic physical or mental health problems that I'd been managing for many years. And all of a sudden, with no warning, these patients who'd come to rely on my care and my detailed knowledge of their histories will have to find a new doctor and start all over again. No opportunities even given for any kind of farewells to be said. So I'm going to be put on trial probably at the end of this year or possibly early next year. I don't really know. And we're in the process of working up to that. And I guess that is where John might say a little bit more about what's going on.
All right, Jereth, thank you. Can you hear me okay, David?
Yes, Greg.
Okay, now I'd like to introduce John Steenhof, who's the principal lawyer at Human Rights Law Alliance. And perhaps, John, you could give a legal perspective on Jereth's presentation, because I think we need to have both views before we go into question time. Thank you, John.
Good evening, Greg, and thank you to you for hosting this webinar and letting people know about Jereth's story. As you heard from Jereth, his case has dragged out since a complaint was made in 2017, and that is almost 5 years ago. So the wheels of justice have rolled slowly here, and we're nowhere near even seeing the inside of a courtroom to hear what the actual charges are against Jereth and to give him a chance to defend himself. Jereth has been unable to practice medicine for almost over 2 years now since his original suspension in August of 2019. So he's almost coming up on the 3rd anniversary of that suspension. The difficulty is that the matter still has to be heard in front of a tribunal. So we are limited in what we can say about Jereth's case because it's still yet to be decided, and it's not appropriate to litigate the matter in the court of public opinion before the arguments come to the court. But we can, and I can, give some context around what Jereth is facing, because for doctors and for other professions, there's this increasing constraint that they have by the fact that they are a regulated profession. So in order for them to be able to practice in the field of medicine, Jereth has to have a license to practice and be registered. And there is a body which used to be based at state level, the medical boards, that determine whether a person is a fit and proper person to practice medicine, whether they have the necessary training and clinical instruction to be able to practice medicine. And it's the same for teachers, for lawyers, and for a lot of different professions. Over the years, those organizations that oversee the professions have become more and more organized and standardized across Australia. So now we have a national law that governs all health practitioners and is regulated by the Australian Medical Board. And they have an organisation alongside them called the Australian Health Practitioners Regulation Authority. That's the APRA that Jereth was talking about. And they are a body, the umbrella body under which all the medical boards, which assists all of the medical boards. So now we have, with this national organisation, a national set of standardised laws that apply to doctors. And the problem is that any bureaucracy grows exponentially, and it's the same with the medical board. And thus to justify that, you have an expansion and a creep in the regulation that they exercise over doctors. So in Jereth's case, what the medical board is going to be arguing is that Jereth has breached the national law that governs doctors. Now, it's very important to be clear about what he's being accused of, or the allegations that are being made. Jereth and his behavior it's only contained to his social media posts. It's not about Jereth's practice as a doctor. Jereth has never received a complaint about his practice as a GP from a patient. Jereth has never received any complaint about his clinical practice from another practitioner. As he said, he's received 2 complaints. And those complaints, we don't know who made the complaints, but we do know that they didn't know Jereth, that they were a member of the public who had never been a patient or a practitioner in his area. And so it clearly was someone who went onto the internet, who saw Jereth's posts, who saw what Jereth had written on contentious issues about his own deeply held personal beliefs, and not just religious beliefs, but also conservative political beliefs on life, on gender and identity, on sexuality, and decided that they didn't like what Jereth was saying. Now, a member of the public who doesn't like what they see from someone on the internet has a lot of choices at their disposal. They can engage in vigorous conversation on social media. Indeed, that's what a lot of social media is taken up with, is people who see the ideas of Jereth, think they're bad ideas, and decide, well, I'm going to respond to Jereth's bad ideas with good ideas. But that's not what this person did. This person decided to try and cancel Jereth by making a complaint to the medical board about Jereth's posts and suggesting that those posts required discipline, no matter that they didn't relate directly to his medical practice. Yet there was the allegation that this will constitute professional misconduct by Jereth. And this should be concerning for everyone everyday Australians are increasingly being observed and also cancelled for expressing ideas that do not align with a progressive agenda. And a lot of this happens through the kinds of codes of conduct that are imposed on professions, and increasingly codes of conduct in everyday workplaces as well. Particularly for doctors, the medical board is now increasingly curbing doctors' freedoms by importing contentious critical theory ideas into their codes of conduct and their rules for what you can and can't say. Issues like cultural safety, white supremacy, colonialism are now making their way into codes which are about things that should be medicine. And it's inappropriate for these boards to be bringing the culture wars into an area which should be about people's physical health and well-being. And that's what should be paramount. That's what Jereth did for people, was look after their health and well-being. And one of the issues that we will be arguing on his behalf is that there simply is not sufficient proximity between Jereth's philosophical, political, and religious views and his practice of medicine to allow the medical board to intrude on the personal posts that he made on social media. It's also inappropriate for a regulator to be compelling speech and to be policing the personal, political, and religious convictions of doctors. Even the Australian Medical Association recognises this. In one of the many changes that were made to the medical board's codes of conduct, they objected. Now, they're hardly a bastion of conservative thought over at the AMA, but they said it would be unprecedented for a regulatory authority's code of conduct to attempt to control a doctor's public expression of opinion in a context that may not impact on the standard or quality of direct patient care or the wider health system, nor reflect a lack of medical professionalism. So even the AMA recognises that there is this tendency for these bureaucratic bodies to be creeping in what they police and what they regulate. So this really is a case that brings to the fore the kinds of injustices that people like Jereth can suffer. He's never, ever been a bad doctor. No one has ever complained that he was a bad doctor. He's a good doctor. We've just had a pandemic where it was all hands on deck for every doctor. They desperately needed people in this area of medical care, and yet Jereth was sidelined and still is sidelined and hasn't been able to practice medicine. And that's probably the biggest and frightening thing about Jereth, is that Jereth is potentially every Australian. Any Australian Christian or conservative could face the kind of treatment that Jereth has faced. And this is a big issue for the wider medical practice and the medical profession. And indeed, all health practitioners face effectively the same body in APRA and in their various boards. And one of the biggest and most frightening issues is that it is the enforcement of a very thin ideological perspective on issues which undoubtedly have a medical component to them, such as abortion, euthanasia, transgenderism and transgender affirming surgery. All of those are matters where there is definitely a medical component, but there is also a very strong ideological and philosophical component as well. These are areas where it is highly contested what treatments are appropriate. It is highly contested what treatments are moral and beneficial to not only the people who are experiencing these issues, but also for the wider community. And doctors should not be fettered and silenced on those issues. If Jereth is unsuccessful in this case, it's going to be mean a very grim future for medical practitioners in Australia, who will have to toe whichever fashionable ideological line is being put forward by the peak bodies at that time. So that's why this is a really important case. We're taking it seriously. We have a good stable of experts, stables of witnesses in this case who will be attesting on various issues. We're looking to engage top quality counsel in Victoria to be able to run this case and run the best arguments on behalf of Jereth. And we're looking for a result that's not just going to mean that Jereth can go back and practice medicine, which he should have been doing for the last 3 years. It's also going to be very important to set the boundaries of what the medical board is able to police for all other health practitioners, and hopefully send a shot across the bows to suggest and to try to establish that they can't police people's political and religious views. And so that really gives the context for Jereth's case, why we're running that case, and why it's important for people to support Jereth. These cases aren't cheap. Most of our work is done either completely pro bono or at substantially reduced rates, but we do have barristers and experts that we have to engage. So Jereth has a Give, Send, Go page, and I'm hoping that you can share links to that and that people would consider not just getting up to speed with Jereth's story, but also would contribute to help Jereth and thus help all Christians who could be facing what Jereth faces.
Thank you, John. We'll share that link very shortly. John, I'm going to start off the questioning, if I may. A two-pronged question, if I may. First of all, now I'm a bush lawyer, John, so you know I hope you'll excuse me, but is there a parallel between Jereth and Israel Folau in terms of speaking out? And the second question, so that we can go right into the heart of it as well, would a religious discrimination bill have protected Jereth? Two questions.
I'm not as attractive as Israel Folau.
I'm glad, Jereth, you said that and not me. The first part of the question was the comparison with Israel Folau. And yes, there definitely is a comparison, because at heart, what we're talking about is a breach of a code of conduct or a set of rules that are prescribed. In many ways, the Israel Folau case is the more egregious case in terms of the way that an organization whose purpose is to ensure that its people play rugby and gets the best Australian rugby players onto a field was policing the political views of their players. In Jereth's case, the medical board is trying to tie his comments to his practice of medicine, to suggest that the views that he has expressed might influence potential vulnerable people not to get medical treatment they seek, might bring the medical profession into disrepute by staining all doctors. There's also, allegations that the tone was inappropriate for a doctor, that some of the posts in the way that they spoke of other practitioners, etc., were inappropriate. So they have tried to link Jereth's social media to his actual practice of medicine. We say the link is not made. We say that, and will strongly argue, that there's no proximity there and that it's based on hypotheticals that just aren't really within the ambit and purview of the medical board. So that's okay. Ultimately, though, it's the policing of people's views that they've expressed privately by your employer. So it's very similar in that regard. Now, the second question was, I'm trying to remember, Greg, about
religious discrimination, but would that have protected Jereth?
So the short answer is the religious discrimination bill would not have protected Jereth completely. The religious discrimination bill was never going to be a one-stop shop for protecting religious freedom. It was a very innocuous and incremental change and protection of religious freedom to give it matching protection to other attributes that they've had for a long, long time. However, it at least would have given him some arguments that he could raise in this case, that his religious views and his personal expression of them should not be policed, particularly where his expression of those religious views was moderate and was reasonable and did not amount to vilification or any sort of hateful diatribes. So there would be limited protection, but not much.
Okay. Now I've just lost my colleague for the moment, but John, I'll go on until he comes back. In your case, Jereth, you can comment as well. are you seeking compensation as well, or just reinstatement of his medical practitioner's certificate?
So the nature of the disciplinary action that's been taken against Jereth is such that it's unlikely that we are actually going to be able to obtain a compensation order out of the medical board, at least at first instance. That won't be in play for the original hearing that we're going to have. It may be something that is the subject of a further application if we're successful.
Okay.
The first port of call is that allegations have been leveled against Jereth, and we need to answer those and run that case and see what the Victorian Civil and Administrative Tribunal has to say about that, and whether they are satisfied that those allegations have been proven, or whether they will side with Jereth and say that no, there certainly is no case of professional misconduct.
Okay, thank you, John. David is back now. Over to you, please, David.
Yes, so I dropped out there, so I'm not sure if you answered the question that I'm going to ask now, which is, does the Medical Code of Conduct have any provisions concerning social media comments and behaviour not related to medical practice? So that's a question for John.
Yes, it does. So the Code of Conduct is one document of an increasing number of documents that that regulate doctors. There's also a social media guide. I believe there have been 3 iterations, different versions of the social media guide that have been released by the medical board and which bind doctors. And those are increasingly broader in what they say doctors are or not able to express in public. The most recent changes to the social media guide included broad prohibitions on criticising public health policy, broad prohibitions on expressing any idea which does not conform to accepted medical practice. It uses vague and broad terms to try to then restrict what doctors can say in public. And that's been problematic, particularly in the context of the COVID pandemic, where there's been a definite silencing of doctors who may be critical of some of the measures that were taken during the pandemic that they viewed as disproportionate and which they viewed as being inconsistent with good health practice. And also any discussion about vaccines that didn't toe the line in terms of what the official guidance on vaccines from Canberra and from the state authorities was. And so it's important to note that in Jereth's case, because they've been actively monitoring his statements, they've also picked up statements that he's made in relation to the Victorian state lockdowns, where he shared with his friends his thoughts on those lockdowns, memes, and his views about those being draconian, and also some of his scientific musings, or they were factual musings about the vaccines, how they were made, whether or not they included the tissue, aborted fetal tissue, etc. Those have been picked up and they've been added as a new and additional allegation that Jereth has breached his obligations by making those posts about the public health policy around COVID and about the vaccines. So we're going to be actively defending those, because we think that there certainly is a line where doctors could be irresponsible on these things. We don't think Jereth's crossed it. We don't think that his freedom to talk about what is effectively a political issue with lockdowns should be constrained in the way that the medical board is suggesting.
Thank you.
So, John, a guide surely is only a guide. It's not a code or a binding set of instructions, surely?
So it's interesting that the Code of Conduct and the Social Media Guide are not expressed in absolute terms, but the national law itself does say that those guides and those codes can be included in any disciplinary action as evidence of breach of the national law. So they're effectively brought under the national law as authoritative for doctors once they have been they've been promulgated by APRA to doctors. Now, there still is lots to be argued around how to interpret those codes. Obviously, they consist of very broad statements about what doctors can and can't do. They're not very prescriptive and not very clear about where the lines are that a doctor shouldn't cross, or about the way that particular proscribed behavior, prohibited behavior, relates to a doctor's practice of medicine. So there's lots of areas of uncertainty, and the thing that lawyers like me like to do is to argue in those areas of uncertainty and try to get some really good precedents set that are going to set wide boundaries for what doctors can say, rather than the ones that APRA is trying to increasingly constrain doctors by and narrow. So that's the status of those codes.
Thank you. Another question, John. Is there not a mediation stage in VCAT's proceedings?
It's quite possible. A VCAT has the power to call for a mediation. In this case, it is allegations made by APRA. It's a disciplinary hearing. And so there's not really going to be an opportunity for Jereth to mediate. Early in the piece, doctors, if they're facing investigation by APRA, will receive a letter that is effectively a please explain letter saying, we've got a complaint, here's what's being alleged, please explain your conduct. And at that stage in the process, doctors can often explain to APRA, undertake certain training or certain remedial actions, agree to certain restrictions being put on their registration, those kinds of things. Once it gets to a formal tribunal, it's unlikely that we're going to be going into mediation with the medical board, but it certainly is an option if there is the view that there might be issues that can be resolved prior to the matter going to hearing.
Jereth, I wonder if we could jump to you for the moment, please. And I will call you doctor because you are a doctor. Jereth, can you give our listeners an idea of what the personal cost has been to you and the financial cost so far?
You can just call me Jereth if you want. All my patients called me Jereth. Anyway,
Jereth, there we go.
Look, it's hard to quantify. I mean, God has been gracious to us and He's provided for us. When it was clear that this was going nowhere, as I said, I was given this sort of that they said at the tribunal at this appeal hearing at the start of 2020, they said, we'll wrap this up we're gonna get an expert report in 4 weeks and then we're going to wrap this up. And I sort of thought, all right, so this will probably be all sorted out by the end of this year at the latest. But as time went on, it became clear to me that this is not moving. So I had to move on with my life. I couldn't sit there doing nothing. So I started a course of study, and that meant that I could get some OS study. So we've been able to get Centrelink payments, and we've been able to make do. So we haven't starved, and I am, now recently, I suppose, qualified to do other kinds of work, which I'm hoping to do. And looking for work actively at the moment. I don't know how much it is in lost earnings or whatever. I'd have to sit down and try and calculate that. But in a sense, well, what's the point? I guess the main thing is that God has been gracious. We've been able to put food on the table. We've been able to pay our bills, and we just have to be careful, and hopefully, hopefully I'll find a new line of work and be able to make a living again. That's the sort of financial cost. I mean, I guess in terms of other costs, well, there's a lot of, there's a lot of grieving to go through. You're working at I had no issue at all with the place I worked with, so nothing there was nothing from them that was a problem. It was a great sort of clinic, a great practice with lots of really good people in it, and I was just sort of thrown. Oh, you know, I couldn't go to work, so I couldn't go to. Yeah, I couldn't see those people anymore. And then the pandemic hit, so you know, everything kind of withdrew, and everyone sort of stayed in their homes anyway, and only made essential trips. So there was no real opportunity to say goodbye to people. You know, I maintained a little bit of phone and email contact with some of my former colleagues, but the whole thing just happened so suddenly. And yeah, and so, you know, just imagine being ripped away from your workplace without any kind of, no farewell, and the patience, you know, I think that's definitely been, there's been a grieving process, because, you know, you get to know these people very, very well. You look, because I'd been in the practice for 10 years, I'd built up, you know, I'd built up relationships with people that were up to 10 years in duration, and you get to know them very well, and you're on first name basis with them, and you know all about their lives, and they, you know, they come and see you regularly, and all of a sudden, well, I couldn't see those people anymore. And you know, I had a couple of patients, elderly patients, pass away just as I was suspended, in the week just before and after I was suspended. And I wasn't able to do anything more than send a sympathy card to their families. I wasn't able to sort of, and I looked after those patients, their, you know, family members as well. You know, they came to see me as a doctor as well. You know, all of a sudden I couldn't speak to them or anything. So I just, all I could do was send a card of sympathy, and that was it. I couldn't, you know, there was no closure at all. You know, when you go from literally sitting there in your consulting room, looking after, you know, seeing your patients, and you've got all these things that you're managing for people, and then bang, it's all gone, with no opportunity to sort of tie up loose ends and hand things over, and there's no closure. It's just a whole lot of relationships just suddenly disrupted and cut off, and you know, that's tough, I think. I guess anyone who's listening who has a long-term relationship with their own doctor, I guess, you know, you could imagine what that's like if you do. You know, sometimes a doctor suddenly falls ill and disappears, and it's pretty hard on people. And because you're talking about quite a deep relationship.
Thank you.
So yeah, I think that's costly.
Okay, thank you, Jereth. David, do you have another question there?
Yes, indeed, to Jereth. Could you tell us, Jereth, are churches and other Christian groups, are they standing with you, so to speak?
In a sort of a broad and general sense, I suppose. I mean, I guess, you know, the question, well, what does that actually look like? I mean, I think people know. I guess people who've heard about it have heard about it, and they know about it, and people have contributed to my fundraising and all that sort of thing. And, you know, I've raised a fair bit of money, but yeah, look, so I guess there's a lot of moral support out there. People, quite a number of people have sort of contacted me. You know, they've reached out in various ways and contacted me and said, oh, these are people I hadn't ever sort of spoken to before, and said, oh, I've heard about what happened to you, and it's terrible, and I'd like to offer you my support and prayers. And so that sort of thing has happened. And I've had, you know, a number of other Christian doctors do that. They've just reached out to me out of the blue and said, gosh, I've heard what happened to you, and it's terrible, and makes me fear for my future, and all that sort of thing. So there's been a bit of it. You know, I wouldn't say I've become a celebrity or anything. I don't really want to be a celebrity. Does that answer your question?
Yes, I think so, Jereth. Another question is, has the mainstream media shown any interest in your situation? Have they covered the story? Have they interviewed you? Have they expressed a view?
Not really, but I haven't really gone to them.
Okay.
When you say mainstream media, I assume you mean,
Yeah.
Channel 9, Channel 10, that kind of thing.
Mm.
Like
Newspapers.
the
Yeah.
Herald Sun, well, I haven't really gone to them. I'm not a famous person, I suppose. So when something
No,
like
but
this
there's
happens to a rugby player, then everybody knows about it because they're famous, but I'm not. So
yeah.
Yeah.
And
My
Jereth, are you aware?
Sorry?
Yes, go on, Jereth. Go on.
I was just going to say, my own church obviously is very, very supportive. So people who know me and organisations, Christian organisations and so on, are supportive, I suppose, and willing to talk about it. But no, I haven't sort of exactly gone out there to try and get attention from the mainstream media. I don't particularly trust the mainstream media, and so they would just frame it as me being a bad guy, and because I'm Christian and I'm homophobic and all that sort of thing. So
Yeah.
Yep. So another question, Jereth, are you aware of any other doctors who have been targeted for their views?
Oh yeah, yep, definitely. So pre-COVID, there were a number of doctors who got in similar sorts of trouble that I did over things like abortion, gay marriage, transgender, that kind of thing. So it's definitely happened to others as well. One doctor, all he did was give he gave a political talk in a church about safe schools, and that created a complaint, which created, he got that please explain letter that John mentioned, and he had to deal with that. And I think he managed to ward it off at that early sort of stage. But that's sort of, there's numerous stories of that kind of thing happening, where people have spoken against safe schools, or people who've spoken against gender transitions and that kind of thing have gone through various stages of the disciplinary process. I'm the only one who's been suspended for 3 years or something like that. It's others have been through other sorts of they've had to do compulsory re-education and that kind of thing, for things that they've written online and so on. And obviously since COVID has happened, there's been other doctors who've gotten in trouble and been suspended for saying things about COVID that are, against the narrative. So,
yeah, John, over to you for a moment. John, in legal terminology, there's a concept called habeas corpus. Bring me the body. I mean, Jereth's been waiting now, 2-3 years. Is that principle not applicable to this particular case, to fast track it, to get Jereth some closure in this?
Yeah, thanks, Greg. You're absolutely right. One of the fundamental principles of a Westminster system of law is the right to a speedy trial, or a right to be heard within a reasonable amount of time. And certainly there will, a big part of this case will be addressing the issue that Jereth did not receive a fair go in that regard, and that there has been an abusive process here in keeping Jereth suspended for such a long time before completing the investigation. So there's going to be a significant component about that in his hearing, because those timeframes are just indefensible.
Yep. And
it's interesting that APRA is subject to regular Senate inquiries, because this is a national body, and the Senate receives feedback from most of the stakeholders, all the stakeholders within the medical profession, including practitioners. And one of the biggest issues that's been raised again and again and again with these inquiries is the fact that they're simply not timely in the way that they are progressing their investigations, and that they are over enthusiastically policing things that go outside of the clinical practice of medical practitioners.
Yeah, thank you. David.
Yes, John, a question about VCAT. My understanding is that it is presided over by a single judge, and that the findings, if they're against the defendant, may be appealed to the Supreme Court of Victoria. Would there be grounds, hypothetically, for an appeal to the Supreme Court and possibly even to the High Court?
Yeah, thanks. That's a good question. And the answer is hypothetically, absolutely. You don't know what grounds of appeal you might have until such time as you get a decision out of a tribunal. And it may be that the issues that we are, the very high level and very important issues that we are agitating in Jereth's case can only really be decided to give good precedent for all doctors at the level of Supreme Court or at the level of High Court. So we are preparing this in such a way that we reasonably foresee that there may be some appeals that come out of it. Even if Jereth is successful, the medical board could appeal it as well.
And again, hypothetically, the guidelines that you've mentioned with regard to social media, I presume that they are adjudicated by APRA. Is that correct, firstly?
So at first instance, APRA, who writes the guidelines, is also the body that administers those guidelines and applies them to practitioners. But it will be up to the courts to give a determination on what are the boundaries and constraints of those guidelines. And we say that many of those guidelines are subject to reasonable constraints that recognize fundamental rights of religious freedom, rights of freedom to express one's views on political issues. So implied freedoms protected under the Constitution, and general freedoms of the right to express, to express your beliefs on things. So there's a lot of uncharted areas here that haven't been decided by courts that are going to be agitated in this case, and they're very important.
John, do you expect the mainstream media to take up interest in the case once it goes to trial?
Based on the other cases that we've run, the media attention span for these things is very short unless there's continuing controversy being generated out of them. Generally, we might see 2 or 3 days of interest leading up to the hearing. Oftentimes you have 1 or 2 reporters who even come into the court and listen to the first couple of days of a hearing. So yes, I do. Not right now. I think that interest might be generated closer to the date of the hearing, and certainly then again once a decision is issued from VCAT.
Yeah. Jereth, before we run out of time, could you share your fundraising page for us on the...
Oh, yep, share screen. So
yes, please. Thank you. While you're doing that,
I'll put the link in the chat. So if people,
yeah, but just so people can see the
and then all right, and then if you go, hang on, let me just do the share screen. All right, so this goes to my browser.
There we go.
And
there we go.
So so that's the link there, and then you go to, you go to Give Now, and you can read the story there.
Okay, so the website is Give, Send, Go, is it?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, right. Thank you, Jereth. That's great.
Okay. No worries.
Okay. Now, question quickly, because we're running out of time before David closes in prayer. First of all, John, just very quickly, and I know you can't give advice. What's your recommendation to people, whether you're a doctor, accountant, or whatever, in making tweets or social media comments? Just a quick comment, John.
Sure. I guess you've got to understand that everything on the internet is going to be seeable and findable by everyone, regardless of what status you put on it. Even your emails, etc., that you send out electronically, you should assume that you're going to have to read it in front of a hostile judge and a hostile cross-examining lawyer someday in court. And hopefully if you think as you're writing things, I'm going to have to read this out in front of someone who is ideologically opposed to me, it will give you the proper amount of caution and discretion in what you put on the internet and what you share. It's important also to determine what tone you're going to take on the internet. So shock jock tactics are often completely fine for those who are expressing left and progressive or very popular views within the zeitgeist. But for those who are expressing conservative views, which are often seen as, fringe and extreme, it may not be the best kind of tone to use, because you're often going to be subjected to an unfair reading.
Thanks, John. I better review my emails, I think, John. David DeLima, could you close in prayer on behalf of our two guests and, of course, the general community as well? Thank you, David.
Yes, Greg. Lord, we give thanks for our time tonight and for the stirring testimony that's been shared. And we do pray for Jereth in particular and ask that you will encourage him, support him and his family through this huge time of turmoil. Be with him as he faces trial and as he defends the truth. Give him strength, we pray. We also ask that churches and other groups will get behind him in prayer and in financial support, and to stand with him morally. We pray for John and his colleagues at the Human Rights Law Alliance as they guide Jereth through this minefield. And we thank you so much for John's expertise, and do pray that he and the team that he'll be assembling will be given wisdom and knowledge in order to confound the forces of darkness that seem to have encapsulated our nation. And we do pray for the nation and ask that the historic freedoms of speech and of expression that we've enjoyed for so long, which are now under threat, would be restored. And just as in the swimming matter in these last few hours, there's been a wonderful turnaround, we do pray for a good result here, which will make clear that people can express their views and that they do enjoy freedom of speech. So we commit this whole matter to you now, in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, David, John and Jereth, on behalf of the governing board of Family Voice Australia, our supporters, our members. Look, we value your comment. Jereth, you will be in our prayers, as you will be, John, as well, when it comes to the time to get in court. Can I thank you very much for being our guest, and I wish you well, and let's keep in touch. Good night, everybody. Thank you very much, and I wish you a pleasant evening.